folks, I'm guessing. Yeah, thank you. So I understand, yeah, that we'll have the recording, but that we'll be able to cut out the sections where we're actually sharing with each other. Um, yeah, I really appreciate the invitation, Angela. I understand that most folks here know each other in this room, more or less. Yeah. Okay. So you've actually I think gathered together before as the local immigration partnership. So I really appreciate, Angela, that you invited me into this session. I have like some perspectives to share with respect to where I think folks are at. I know it's a very complex time and there's a lot of things competing for your time. So what I'm offering is one way into the work of equity and anti-racism. It's a lot of what I'm doing right now. But for me, it's just a new way of kind of labeling the work of social policy and the work of community building. So I hope that you'll come into the work in the same way and find connections to what you're already doing, and then creating sort of space to have an equity lens to what you could do more of. There'll be lots of opportunities for us to share with each other. I do know that there's a lot of rich knowledge and experience in the room. And so, given that, we're certainly not starting from scratch. So, there will be some questions just to help kind of know where we can support each other in this work, where we can leverage some resources, where we maybe don't have to create something. Without a prior kind of template, maybe that we could borrow or build together. We've done very similar work with AMSA, sort of the umbrella organization for settlement serving organizations. So I'm kind of bringing that to bear on this group today that we probably have some more scalable initiatives as we get to know each other a bit more. If you have any issues navigating the platform, please let us know either by opening up your mic or letting us know in the chat. We'll use the chat function as well as Slido. So if you do have a smartphone or can just use your laptop to sort of navigate to the page, we'll have two questions on the Slido later on. And then feel free to add captions to the session today. It's one of the features on the bottom of your Zoom session where you can add captions. So if you need help with that, please let us know. Okay, so without further delay, we kind of thought about this session as foundations in equity. So just sort of how do we build sort of a shared understanding of this work? All of us work either together or at least adjacent to each other in serving members of the public in Delta. And so part of my welcome is recognizing whose land you're on. So for me, I'm joining you today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I wanted to invite you to also think about whose land you're on. So if you could share that as part of your introduction in the chat, or if you wanted to open your mic and also share your name, your pronoun, which organization you represent, and the territories you're joining from. That would be appreciated. And so, as Angela said, my name's Jennifer. My pronouns are she, her. And I really wanted to bring to light this particular call to action today, call to action 47, which is calling upon all levels of government to repudiate or reject concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous peoples and lands. This is one of the simplest places to start is the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. This is one of many of the 94 calls to action. Many organizations that I've worked with are striving to integrate this in their staff onboarding, building meaningful territorial acknowledgements, but also not stopping there to actually change their agendas in the way they're doing their work in order to reflect and be in service of the calls to action. So I thought this one would be a really simple and obvious one for us to start with. Because one of the kind of first things I wanted to share with you is that in this space, as we are hopefully going to be able to share some of our own perspectives and where we come from, I wanted to sort of hold this very simple, I hope, and memorable tool for us to all use and honor, which is EVES, Empower, Validate, and Safe Space. And essentially, what this is that when we're sharing in spaces, whether it's your staff that are coming to you, clients that are coming to you, colleagues that are coming to you, that we want to make sure that folks feel empowered to share what their lived experience is and what they're dealing with. And that starts really with validation. So it may not be your experience. Of something that someone is sharing with you, but it's certainly an opportunity to validate someone else's truth and their lived experience. So you don't have to agree, but there is a lot of value in validation that would hopefully empower folks to come forward, not only one time, but maybe multiple times to share what's going on. And then you as a leader have a better read on what's happening in your organizations and communities. I'm sure a lot of you already practice this. The last one is safe space. So really ensuring confidentiality, especially in this space where we're sharing maybe some of the challenges that we're grappling with, but also ideas and curiosities and successes that we've had. And that confidentiality means you can always share the learnings, but not the sort of names or organizations where the learning is coming from. And we can use that same tool when we're interacting with individual staff or clients in our spaces. So I just wanted to pause and go to the chat here to see if anyone's introduced themselves. Thank you, Sepia, calling in from Fraser Health. Really appreciate that you took time to join us. Karn from Share, great to have you here. Ginny, thank you so much. And yeah, please feel free to keep the introductions coming, especially so that we can keep in touch after this session with each other and the work that you all are doing. So I wanted to be clear about what we'll cover in our time together. It's only 90 minutes at most, maybe less. But really, three things we wanted to cover was one, to identify discrimination in our organization. So a lot of times it's not clear where it's coming up or if something is, an inequity or an injustice. So we'll hone in on what that looks like in specific versions of discrimination. We'll be able to identify our individual roles in addressing this type of discrimination, of course, starting with where we just started, which was Eve's, empowering validation and safe space, and then building on the foundations for equity and justice amongst the sort of local immigration partners in the room. So that's sort of the goal and the hope throughout this session. I'll do this in sort of three parts. The first part, which we've done, is sort of the welcome and the group agreement with the EVS, Empowerment Validation Safe Space. And then I'll draw us in to some of the Canadian and British Columbia examples of discrimination and racism that have been legislated, so legalized versions of discrimination that I think give rise to the kinds of patterns and inequities we're seeing today. And these could be very useful for you to share with staff teams or even just have a discussion with staff teams or clients about some of these issues. Unfortunately, it's not common knowledge, as in folks may have not learned this in their primary or secondary education. And today, with so much disinformation and misinformation, it might be difficult to sort of parse out what the information really is. So what I'll share with you are legislated examples of discrimination and racism, and examples that actually come from the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, the BC Human Rights Commissioner, and other reputable sources. So we kind of know that they've been researched and well documented. And then we'll end with some of the reflection questions that Angela had mentioned at the beginning. And those I'm hoping really provide a place for you to honor how much you've already done in this field and how much you already contribute in the sector, and hopefully build on some of the good practices that we already have with the information that we'll build throughout this session. And then we'll come to closing, which will reflect on some of the questions that you folks have raised in your registration and survey prior to this event. So hoping it's really relevant and something that is useful for you. And thanks to folks for continuing to introduce yourselves in the chat. So hello, Nick. We've got Melanie from Work BC. Really great to connect with you all. Erica from Options Community. Gina, also from Options. It's awesome to have some colleagues. Olga, so good to have you. That's awesome. Yeah, it's really nice to see some familiar folks too. So we're going to start with this kind of framing. And as I promised, we're going to talk about some specific examples of discrimination so that we can start to see the inequities that we're actually trying to tackle. Without really knowing what the inequities are, it's very difficult to do anything about them. Amartya Sen has a book about justice that says the easiest pathway to justice is by addressing injustice, because it's much easier to actually tangibly understand what that is. Just going to pause for a sec. Is there any background noise for folks? It's okay. Okay. Thanks, Ginny. But also let me know if there is. Someone just started weed whacking outside. So December in the lower mainland, I guess. Okay. So the four that I thought we can hone in on here is ableism, homophobia, anti-Black racism, and anti-Indigenous racism. I think these are probably the most common types of discrimination that we see, but also ones that are hopefully useful for us to have a working definition of, because some are really specific. So we'll start with ableism. And essentially, ableism is a belief system that sees persons with disabilities as being less worthy of respect and consideration, less able to contribute and participate, or of less inherent value than others. Ableism may be conscious or unconscious. It can be embedded in institutions, systems, or broader culture of a society, and it can also limit the opportunities of persons with disabilities and reduce their inclusion in their life and in their communities. Um, so I'll just sit with that for a moment in this group. This might be like very personal for folks. So just being cautious that there's no requirement to share personal experiences. But certainly, if you've witnessed this, experienced it, or have reflected on this before, or maybe it is familiar, either in your workplace or your community, just to hang on to that for a moment. Because the question really to this group is, how does this show up? How does ableism show up in our organizations, our work with staff, or our work with clients? Um, And the second definition here of the four is homophobia. Also, probably familiar or personal for folks. So please, like, no obligation to share direct personal experience. But if you've witnessed this, please think about how homophobia shows up. So the real definition that we're using here is encompassing a range of negative attitudes and feelings towards homosexuality or people who are identified or perceived as being two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and more. It has been defined as contempt, prejudice, aversion, hatred, or antipathy. Homophobia is observable in critical and hostile behavior such as discrimination and violence. Um, so I want to pause there and recognize this is, again, just a starting definition. Um, and thinking about how homophobia might be showing up in our language, our policies, our organizations, our work with clients, amongst clients. The third of the four definitions is anti-Black racism, and this includes policies and practices that are rooted in our institutions, like educational institutes, healthcare, justice. They mirror and reinforce the beliefs, attitudes, prejudice, stereotyping, and/or discrimination towards people of African descent. So in Canada, anti-Black racism stems from the transatlantic slave trade and legalized slavery as a tool for economic interests of white settlers. Anti-Black racism in particular is documented in the UN Working Group report on the status of Black people in Canada. It's a very in-depth report that I would strongly recommend folks read. There's recommendations in there for every sector of society to identify and address anti-Black racism. And the last of the four is anti-Indigenous racism, which is the ongoing race-based discrimination, negative stereotyping, and injustice that's experienced by Indigenous peoples within Canada. It includes discriminatory government laws like the Indian Act and the residential school system. Anti-Indigenous racism in Canada is well documented, as we started with the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, but also in the calls for justice in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit Peoples report. So I'm inviting folks to sit with these definitions and think about at this point, how are these showing up in your organization, in your work with clients, in your work with staff? And so I'll just pause there to allow folks to share. Great. So really the purpose of this introductory level of definitions is hopefully for us here to have a conversation about this, but also to take this back to our teams and the folks that we work with. Sometimes folks may be dealing with this stuff in our midst and we're not aware of it, or we're not available for the conversation. But just by naming it, we can definitely be more explicit about how this is showing up. Sometimes it's so insidious, like the ripping of a sticker is maybe an explicit example, but the impact of it may not be known unless we actually talk about the impact of having seen that sticker there at one day and then ripped off the next. So this is part of that validation, is giving folks a chance to speak their lived experience, speak what their truth is, and then being able to recognize also that validation isn't about anything except making sure we're not normalizing this kind of discrimination or inequity or racism from proliferating in our spaces. So there really isn't a wrong place to start. I would say the limitation of some of these definitions is that we don't actually know until you're from these communities. So yes, it's a way to start to understand and be more aware, start to watch for these things, especially as leaders in your organization. But it certainly doesn't replace the real lived experience of people who identify with these communities. So that still needs to be a part of our work in moving this forward. So I'll just spend a couple minutes here to root us into where these issues of discrimination are really coming from. As we know in this group, it's not individual. It's largely systemic, and it's given rise through legislation. So as I promised at the beginning, we would ground ourselves in where does this stuff actually come from. So in Canada, and I mentioned this in the definitions, anti-Indigenous racism is baked into our own legislation. The Indian Act having sexist and racist impacts and implications. Anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism. We didn't go into detail on anti-Asian racism, but an example in Canada would be the head tax, but also our own Immigration Act from its inception, which limited Black, Asian, and Jewish immigrants from entering the country. You may have heard of the continuous journey regulation, which is another regulation which had racist implications, for example, on Vancouver shore without allowing the Komagata Maru resident passengers to disembark on our shoreline, resulting in the death and violence towards people on that ship. So it isn't sort of just an interpersonal issue. It's actually given rise by our political actors presently, but also historically in some of the ways we've structured our society here. So I think this is important in my view, to have conversations about this, to name this early often so that we refrain from blaming individuals. And that unfortunately is one of the number one reasons individuals aren't coming forward about racism, gender-based violence, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, because of the experience of being blamed or the fear of not being believed. And when we know the origin of discrimination and racism at a national level, we can become more empathetic and validating of the experiences people do have, rather than trying to find ways to disqualify folks. So in the British Columbia context, I thought this would be useful for this group as well. Recently, the BC Human Rights Commissioner conducted, I believe 2 or 3 years ago, an scan of employment inequity. And this is just employment. So we're not talking about incarceration, we're not talking about educational access, healthcare, etc. This is just a snapshot on employment. And I encourage you to check out any of the reports written by the Human Rights Commissioner's office. They're very well researched. But what they found was a couple of very interesting and alarming features in present day British Columbia. One is that people of color with the same level of qualification or experience and education are making 86 cents less to the dollar of folks that aren't people of color. Also, that 70% less is earned by people with disabilities, and 52% less is earned by individuals who are Indigenous, who are women, and who live on reserve. And so those are pretty alarming elements to me about how individuals are experiencing on a daily basis the impacts of ongoing systemic and institutionalized racism and discrimination, both from ability, from race, from gender, um, and the intersection of those. So I will move us to a quiz now on Slido. And this quiz, anyone can do, but in this group, we'll go ahead and do this together. It is anonymous. The question really is, how do you and your organization currently respond when anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, homophobia, ableism show up in your organization? So how do we currently respond? And Angela, I'll just ask for your help in getting the Slido.
Yes. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, you should be able to see the Slido now. Just scan the QR code, or you can go on slido.com and put the code in.
To training, professional development, learning opportunities. Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing these. I think this exact question could be valuable in a staff meeting setting to get a read from your own staff teams on what they do when these incidences are showing up. Um, and whether or not they have a good grip on what tools are in place, or if you have the tools that you think you do, and if staff actually know where those are, what they are, who to go to. And some organizations don't have a robust human resources department. So just thinking through how we um, guide folks to make a complaint, to report something that's happening. I wanted to pull on one aspect that was shared here, which was the reporting. It was one of the first comments shared. Um, the reports are taken in, but we're not sure what happens to them. So that's a really interesting example, because the reporting is super important. And in some organizations, what we'll see is a quarterly or annual report out of how many cases were opened, how many cases were resolved, and how many cases were not taken forward. And that just demonstrates to folks that we do actually something with these reports that are being taken in. Some of the reasons why folks, in addition to not being validated, don't come forward is because we don't think anything happens with the complaints that we make. I think any one of us could say that you've had that experience, or you've witnessed or have seen someone have that experience. And so that's why the report out would be important, to encourage staff and clients that we do take this seriously. And it is a part of our wider accountability to you and to us and the people that we serve. Um, the last piece I'll say is the budgeting of some of these ideas and examples, is sort of how much staff training is resourced. Professional development is usually voluntary and not consistent across organizations. So just noticing some of the limitations, but also opportunities to think about how much budget is actually allocated to these examples of how you currently respond. And if that's some place of advocacy or collaboration for folks in this room, to think about as a partnership group, or as a wider services to the public in Delta. So I'll leave it here for this question. And is it okay with you, Angela, if I pull back my slides here?
Feel free.
Okay, thank you. So thanks again, folks, for your openness and willingness to share. I hope that also piqued some interest in ways that your organization might be able to borrow some examples from each other. And that really is the hope of some of this work together, is that we share what we're doing as experts in the field, doing this work on a daily basis. Um, the second reflection question here is about what we can offer to staff and newcomers, knowing how these issues are showing up. So we just had a good example, a set of examples of ways that you respond. I'm wondering what else, in your view, could you offer to staff and newcomers, knowing especially how isolating these examples could be, the example of the sticker on the washroom, how that might prevent someone from coming back to your service or program at all. So in that case, knowing that it could be a complete deal breaker for the people that we're trying to serve from coming back to us, from trusting us, from using our services and programs that we offer, what could we offer to staff and newcomers, knowing how these issues are showing up, how individualized they could be? Any thoughts there? And feel free to open up your mic. All right, and we're just coming. Thank you, Angela. So, yeah, as we noticed, really, it's about having a good cross section of all of these things. But best case scenario, your top priority is budgeting and resourcing this work so that you actually have an ability to monitor what's getting done. Um, I like the saying that what gets budgeted gets done. And I think that's true in this case, that we don't want this work of addressing inequities to stop at training and education. And as we learned in some of the examples today, that that isn't enough, that it needs to be backed by policies and implementation with our staff teams included in performance plans and measured so that we as leaders would know, is this hitting the mark? And to what extent is this affecting the change we would like to see amongst our client base? Are we getting more diverse clients in the door? Are we getting more diverse staff applying to roles in the organization? And retaining those staff in our organization. So just some examples of things that we can look for to improve the work overall. So kind of the last question here before we come to closing is about where you need the most support. And so if folks are comfortable sharing in the chat or reflecting on your own where you think you need the most support, I do think for Angela and folks who lead this work that it helps us to know where you need support. But the second part of this question is really about leveraging the richness of the resources in the room already, which is the kind of support you can offer to fellow partners at the local immigration partnership table. Something that we noticed kind of across the province is that larger metropolitan urban centers are pretty well resourced with collaboration amongst lots of public sector partners, but some of the smaller rural and remote centers of the province really struggle with sometimes being the only public service provider. So I would just like to encourage this group to think about if you could offer support even outside of your city or region to other smaller rural or remote centers that may not be as well resourced, but also are facing some of these issues of inequities in a very acute way right now, to a point where even staff are being targeted when they're delivering the work. So I think it's important to name that I hope that we don't just silo ourselves in the urban kind of metro examples, but perhaps see some collaboration even outside of Delta, outside of your area that you could lend support. So I'll just pause there for the chat or for the microphone. Where do you need the most support, but also what kind of support could you offer to fellow partners? I appreciate that, Angela. So the summary here is the purpose for the work, which is like retooling ourselves because we don't want to replicate harm in our organizations amongst our staff, amongst the people that we serve as clients, and to really to take action that is intentional. Especially when we're people that are in positions of power, we can change the institutions that we work in. They are upheld by people like me and you. And although it may feel like an individual within this makeup of an organization is not powerful enough, I think in this room today, there's been a lot of examples of how the tools, the policies, the procedures, the practices, the reflections of your own experiences in your organization were changed because of you. And so I really hope that it gives us a reset in terms of the role that we can play, in terms of acknowledging the harm that is impacting the reality of people on a daily basis who are already marginalized. But that hopefully this work helps us bring this work more to the forefront to be able to stop the harm, at least in our spaces, and be able to continue to pursue justice by addressing those inequities, because that's the core of our work. And so I'm really grateful that folks in this room are doing this work, that hopefully you continue to come together. I hope that you can use some of the definitions and the framing that we use today: empowerment, validation, safe space, the examples of discrimination and racism, both in a practical sense, but also in the legislated examples, to start those conversations if you're not already having them, to let the folks know that you work with and that you work for, that you're aware of how these things are operating in our system and interpersonally, and we don't want them to continue to get in the way of people's success. So I wanted to open up for any closing questions and address some of the questions that were asked in the original kind of sign up or survey for this particular event. And one of them was about lack of diversity in applicants. And so I wanted to kind of harken back to something we talked about already, which was about like, first, why do we want more diverse applicants? What good would it really do for your organization? And how will you keep them there? So I think there's lots of effort on the recruitment side of things and wanting to show a more diverse complement. But on the retention side, because of the inability for people to move up in the organization or experiences with discrimination or racism, that we're unable to retain these folks. So I would strongly encourage a thought towards how your job description at the front end can talk about the good work that you're doing, the mechanisms you have to report, to disclose incidents, what kinds of employee resource groups are provided, professional development, or all staff training. And I would say that all staff training followed by policies is perhaps the most compelling, because for me, as a person coming into an organization, I would then know that my colleagues are equipped with the same kind of training. As it isn't seen as voluntary or nice to have, but rather a must have. Um, Another piece is this requirement to sort of justify hiring folks from diverse or marginalized backgrounds. Employment equity is a part of our legislation. There really isn't a need to explain it much more beyond that. But I hope that the conversation about legislated discrimination helps explain to staff teams that there are forces at play that continue to cause specific groups in society to be disadvantaged, especially when it comes to employment. And so part of that conversation is with staff, but also leaning on legislation like employment equity to underscore that it's our obligation as employers to encourage and support the hiring of folks who are repeatedly marginalized, and also to support their retention. So there was another comment about performative actions and having sort of a one size fits all approach. And what do we do about that? I think if we can pull something forward from earlier, which was the impact, so that we did mention that the intention was good, it was well meaning, but it didn't have the desired impact, or we didn't check with the people that were supposed to be positively impacted. Did it have the desired impact? So I would say that a really great place to start would be with that intention being anti-racist explicitly, budgeting for that work to be done in a dedicated way by personnel, with training, with support. But if it isn't budgeted, I would say it likely won't be getting done. And it will remain sort of performative or generalized rather than something specific that you can measure and say, hey, in a year from now, we'll see this change in our staff complement or in the clients that we serve. Or maybe we're expecting to see a spike in the number of reports about incidents in our organization, because now we've made it anonymous, we've made it multilingual. And those could be some of the features that you're looking to actually shift. And that, I think, will help ensure that things aren't one size fits all, and that they move from just being performative. I know there was a reference to equity statements. Those are absolutely important, but if they're not coupled by implementation of actual policies and all staff training, employee support, reporting mechanisms, then they will only remain statements and sort of give this false sense of security to folks coming in. So I would just say, kind of coming back to that budgeting piece, what's specific about what we can offer, so that we can measure if we're having the change, the desired affected change that we wanted or not. The other piece was about promoting the importance of equity, diversity, inclusion, however you kind of title this work within your organization. So I would say, like, remember that the whole organization is colonial, and that the space here that we're operating within is very much steeped in colonial constructs. And so to remember to give yourself the breathing room to understand that you need to be validated in the work as well, and that it really isn't up to you to champion this work on behalf of your whole organization, but in your part of the organization. I know it's a burden, especially from us, people who are already from marginalized groups, who are bearing the weight of this work and trying to convince our organizations to do something about it. But I do hope that in this room, in the local immigration partnership group, that you find allies who can help advocate for this work with you, but also leaders in our organization who know that this isn't just your job to do, but that actually it is about wider staff benefits. It's about efficiency in the organization, retaining the folks that we've done a good job to actually recruit in the first place, and then attracting the clients that deserve the services and programs that we're actually delivering. And then I hope the last kind of takeaway is to engage your own teams about these issues, even your clients in the spaces that they're in, so that you can actually shape the work together and recognize that there's space for nuance. There's no one size fits all, and just talking about it is a good way in to start naming and validating that these issues are real. They're not about the individual, and they stem from something much more structural and systemic. So yeah, so I really hope that this is a useful way into the work, that you feel connected to what you're doing, that you have such an important role you're already playing, that you have allies in me, in Angela, and the folks at this table. I'm really glad to hear your feedback and what else I could do to support you if this is useful. So please don't hesitate to let me know. But with that, I wanted to thank you for taking the time for this topic in the day, and just recognize that it is heavy. It's a lot of thinking. So just to take time to decompress, I hope before you tackle new things in your day. Thank you.